This is King Noble Black Supremacy. And with this particular video, I want to call it Jabari's Kemetic philosophy versus black supremacy. I got to go in on this for many reasons. Because in his debate with Michael Edwards and in his prior videos, his debate with Zion Lex, a lot of things were exposed that I think need to be dealt with. For one, what Jabari has to realize, he has to make a distinction between the myth and the reality. He's having a problem there. Our ancestors were not a myth. A lot of these symbols on the wall, he considers myth based on the white man's narrative, or even based on the white man's interpretation or translation of the hieroglyph, going all the way back to Champollion and dealing with Faulkner, whoever. Some crackers' translation or interpretation of these symbols. I won't deal a lot with the interpretations of the symbols in this particular video, interpretations of symbolism, because a lot of those interpretations could be wrong, and they might not have it. They don't know what that meant, what these symbols meant. What some of these symbols meant are very obscure. And even he said there's several different meanings to the same symbol. There might be 4 different meanings. And then we know that there is many meanings to these symbols as there are schools of thought. From the Nubians to the Metuneter or Sarset Society, from Menfodisi to Baba Haru to Supernova Islam, Queen of Four. There's many interpretations as there are groups where they slightly may pronounce the language differently, the words differently, and they may have a different interpretation of the symbols. We can throw in there the Earth Center. We can throw in there Ashra Kwesi. We can throw in there Muta Ashby. The list goes on. There are many interpretations and meanings of these symbolisms. Won't go in on that. I just had to make that point clear. We can get lost in this symbolism, and we can go forever with symbolism. No one has a definitive definition or a definitive understanding of what these exact symbols on the wall means in particular. No one has a monopoly on that. It's left up for the individual's interpretation, whether they want to go with white people's translation of the hieroglyph, or whether they want to go to Egypt themselves and see what comes to mind when they see these symbols. We know how vast the possibility for the interpretation of these symbols are. Don't want to make this video about symbolism, just want to make that clear. But we also have to separate our ancestors from the myth, because the myth is a whole school of thought. The myth is a whole dimension in and of itself. I'll just call it the dimension of myth. And then there are actual ancestors that built the pyramids, that established a great civilization. This is not a myth. This is a reality. The existence of our ancestors are not a myth, but are a reality. And like many would say, is a historical fact. Some of us have got more caught up in myth then we've got caught up in the facts. Even history can only take you so far. When the white man controls all your mummies, your artifacts, archaeology, he controls all this. He has all this in his possession. And what he doesn't have, the pale Arab got. So even history is going to be very arguable. You can argue history. But what we cannot argue is that we and our ancestors are one, that the same blood and the same DNA that flow through those ancient people, that developed those myths, that built those great civilizations and built those pyramids, lie within us as a people. I don't think that Jabari would argue that, or any black historian would argue that. That's been one of the main purposes of their work, is to prove how we are those people. We are that great civilization, unarguably. And that, as that is an accepted fact, that we are those ancient people that built those pyramids, that built those great civilizations, that came up with those myths, then we are that now, and we can come up with new myths and new symbolisms. So we don't have to be limited to the white man's narrative or translation of ancient language to be in tune and be in touch with ourselves. Some of you have made the myth more important than the man. But I would say the man is more important than the myth. Because whatever was in our ancestors to bring about this myth, to bring about these great civilizations, lies within us today. So we don't have to be limited or locked into the white man's interpretation or translation of what our myths were in the past. We can go within ourselves and we can accept the return of these ancestors, the return of black divinity, which many of you say is being illustrated. Many of the priests say is being illustrated on those walls, that they're proving and showing forth black divinity. Black divinity ain't limited to those walls. It's not limited to those myths. It is us, if that is what those walls are showing. So when do we go within inside of ourselves? When do we look to ourselves and look to those that are the return of those ancient beings? And that's when I got to talk about Dr. Malachi York. Dr. Malachi York reflected the ancient consciousness and the ancient mindset that created that language, that manifested great civilization, that created the pyramids. He is the return of that awakened mind. That's why he's given you the Nuwapic language. He's given you the language. He's broke down the hieroglyphs. He's translated the Meduneter without the crackers, without the white man, without the devil. He's traveled within himself and travel interdimensionally to other planets. He is the return of those ancient beings, which they call the Nagaru. And he brought you language. He brought you culture. He brought Egypt to the West. I use him but as an example to show that the ancient ones, the ancestors, are us. Don't get caught up in the myth to the point where you don't realize who we are anymore. And now you have to go through the devil. You have to get a plane ticket. You have to go look at these walls. You have to scrap together whatever artifacts or whatever monument that he didn't destroy and try to piece it together, when the main missing piece of the story is my story, You are the mystery, the missing piece to all the walls, to all the artifacts, to all the fossils, to all the monuments, to all the relics. The missing piece is you. We are that missing piece. And it's not till we become whole within ourselves without the Europeans' intervention, without the Europeans' information. We will continue to be a slave. We will continue to experience ourselves objectively like the European. We'll be outside of ourselves looking in, when we need to be inside of ourselves as ancient Nubians, ancient Kemetic beings. Inside of ourselves looking out. The new Kemetic people are so far off because they're not even outside of themselves looking in. They're outside of themselves looking at symbols that were outside of themselves, that are on walls. He would say, Jabari would say, that we want to study the principles or the symbols that were left by the greatest civilization that ever lived or ever was. This is what he would say. But what you have to realize is for one, it would have to be, if you want to call it the greatest civilization, you would have to first say that it's the greatest one that you know of. It's the greatest one that the devil or the cracker has dug up and put before you. It's the greatest one as far as your imagination and your consciousness can expand to. I would say the greatest one has never been done. The greatest one is the one that when we awaken to who we are and realize that we are our ancestors, that we are them. The greatest civilization we have yet to do yet. But as long as we are looking back and worshiping less than 0.1% of our potential and our capability, we will never tap the power to create the greatest civilization that has ever existed. Now, Kemet, what you call Egypt, the Nile Valley's civilization, Tamaray, whatever name you want to go by and call it, is arguably, to me, the greatest civilization that we've had. That's arguable. Because for one, we allowed the Hyksos to come in. We allowed crackers to come into Alexandria. We allowed the Greece. We allowed them to come in and destroy it. We allowed the Arabs to come in and destroy it and run us out. And now what we call Egypt, what we call the greatest civilization, is under control and rule of Arabs that parade themselves as the Egyptians when they know they don't look like a goddamn thing on the wall. Don't a damn thing on the wall match them or look like them. I would call it the greatest fallen civilization. Because clearly we made some very serious mistakes. And it wasn't so great to end up where it is today, as we look at the ruins and the remains and look what is left of it and who runs it and who controls it. And by calling that the greatest civilization, we overlook the multidimensionality of greatness to see the greatness of other civilizations that we have had in Timbuktu, in Mali, in Spain, in North Africa. We've had other great civilizations as well. And a civilization should not be measured completely by its materialistic manifestation, its materialistic endeavors, conquests, but also by the level of spiritual awakening and spiritual development of the people. And in Kemet, some of their ideas that they had in Egypt, if you look at what people lived, not your interpretation of symbolisms of what people lived, many of us, even within the Black conscious community, have ascended beyond some of those ideas. As far as trying to bury ourselves with certain gems and certain material objects to take them into the afterlife. We know that the afterlife exists within our consciousness, and many of us have transcended the illusion of death. Those of us who are awakened. So our spiritual realization, to some degree, trumps that of our ancient ancestors. Not to say that there's not a lot to learn, a lot to do. But we tend to stick to the symbolisms on the wall and overlook the behaviors and the activities and the culture of the people to see how those symbolisms affected people that lived in that time. We don't do that. We come into this present time and we interpret it as we want. We interpret those symbols in a way that prove that we're going to ascend and that we're going to be in tune with the ancestors and accepted into the realm of the ancestors in the afterlife based on what is on those walls. And we come up with our own narrative and our own symbolism. And we interpret the myth in ways that we see fit, as you can see Jabari doing and other Kemetic scholars. They interpret the information as they will. And they interpret it with a modern mind. And in a way that's consistent with the phobias, the hang-ups, and the cultural framework of people within the society that we live in today. So we can call that a modernized interpretation of ancient symbolism. But we don't have to depend on ancient symbolism if we realize that we are the ancients. If we realize that we are those entities and those beings, and that they have returned among us, the awakened have returned among us. And we understand our culture, our language, and the divine potential that lies within our existence. And we don't need no devils or their books or their translations. Jabari tried to make a distinction between the Hebrew Israelites and Kemet. They both depend on myth. He agreed on that. And they both determine what is real and what is myth based on their own convenience. Both of them do that. When it doesn't agree with what is the unanimous or the consensus of morality within the present society, when it does not agree with that, they say that it is symbolism. They say that it is another meaning to it. And when it agrees with the modern consensus reality on morality within the conscious community or the self-righteous community, then they say it's literal. The problem here is that nothing on those walls limit who and what we are as a people. And nothing that we are able to translate or are not able to translate or are able to interpret or not able to interpret can limit the divine consciousness that lives within us, that created Kemet and developed myth. The same originators of myth are walking around on the planet today. This is a fact. When you start believing in myth and trying to correlate or align your understanding of myth with history, you're going to need the white man. You're going to need his archaeology. You're going to need his artifacts. You're going to need his museums. You're going to need his citations. You're going to need his references. But in us developing those myths as the ancient people of this planet, we did not need white citations, white references, white archaeologists, white artifacts, white scholars, white philosophers. We did not need it. We did not need them to develop chemistry, math, sciences, music, art. We did not need them to do it. So why does a divine people that is reflected in the symbols, who share DNA with those who had the greatest civilization, need the white man today and his references and his citations and all this type of stuff? He says we need to have our own scholars now so that we can begin to control the narrative of what happened in Egypt and what happened in Kemet. Fuck a narrative. We must now activate and access our divine power through realizing who we are and accepting the return of the awakened ones that have come among us, that have manifested on the earth, that embody these light years of information and knowledge. Those same divine beings had returned, coming forth by night and by day, returning to the planet now with this divine information. And we're so distracted by myth and symbolism that we unable to have devotion, respect, and reverence for the awakened beings with the same DNA and blood running through the veins as who we call our ancestors. We are unable to accept that. We're even unable to accept the divinity of who we are in first person. We're objective. And we look at our own greatness like a white man in a museum. We dig up our own dead like a white man. Like the damn devil. Johnny come lately. I had to go in on this. You have to look at the reality of how people lived and what they did in Egypt and what they did in Nubia. Those are our ancestors. We can connect directly to our ancestors and the ancestral energy. We don't need no myth. The ultimate myth, the ultimate parable, the ultimate symbol, the ultimate symbolism lives within our third eye, lives within our inner conscious world. It lives inside of us and it comes out in small droplets. The residue of it is on the walls. A very minute imprint of it is on the walls. But it lies within us. We must separate the myth from the reality. And start back embracing the reality of who we are. And tapping into that. And that's what Black supremacy is. It is the awakening of who we are as a people. And the ability to perceive the divine reality in this present day and time, in this present world that we live in. And to activate it. To perceive it. To be conscious. That's what being conscious is. You can be a historian, you could be an archaeologist, but that doesn't make you conscious. Conscious is when you can perceive the divine reality in the present world in the present moment. You are awakened now. Then becomes now. I got to go in on this. The Orishas, the ancestors, and us, we are one. There are different levels of consciousness, different levels of ascension. Black God consciousness, the Orishas, the ancestors, and the Orishas and the Neteru are the same. And the ancestors, the Neteru, the forces of nature, the Neter or nature, it's all one and the same. They're just different levels of consciousness and different levels of awakening as beings. You can become a living Orisha or living ancestor in this present moment. And you can live in the divine, which is a parallel universe to the one we live in now. You can actually live in divine consciousness. You can walk around now in the hereafter, in the realm of Ogun, here after your sleep, here after your unconsciousness, here after your death to the knowledge of who you are and the knowledge of yourself. This part one, I'll come back with a part two. Join my website, www.kingnobleuncensored.com. Follow me on Instagram, kingnobleuncensored.c.o.m. and subscribe to my YouTube page right now, King Noble Guru. Black Supremacy.